So you think about the Church of Scientology. People might have a few different kind of immediate associations. You know, you like they might think, for example,
I think
about
it's a
this.
privilege to call yourself a Scientologist, and it's something that you have to earn.
Scientology loves to use this word end phenomena. Every level has an end phenomena, that you attain. And Tom Cruise shows that. That video with him in the black turtleneck sweater.
A Scientologist is someone who can look at the world and really see what it is. Not only look at it and see it, but be able to go and be effective and do something about it.
He's as arrogant and as untouchable as could possibly be, and at the same time, he looks like an utter crazy paranoiac.
And they said, so, like, have you met an SP? And I looked at him, and I thought, oh, what a beautiful thing, because maybe one day it'll be like that. You know what I'm saying? Maybe one day it will be that. Wow, SPs, like, they'll just read about those in the history books,
That's where it takes you. That's the end phenomena of the Scientology bridge.
Yeah, with Tom Cruise, like the thing that's interesting about that video was produced, I think in like 2004, 2005, and he was given the Freedom Medal of Valor by Scientology, which was something they just completely made up to give to him. And
this is like the
Yeah.
Simpsons, the medal for outstanding achievement in the field of excellence.
Yes, it's very much like that, right? Because for those who don't know, L. Ron Hubbard was in the Navy. And so a lot of Scientology is based around the Navy and kind of military language and lingo, and like the outfits of the Sea Org are all military-esque and sort of it's weird. And so when he's giving that little like video, you just go like, wow, he is nuts and making no sense. Like he's rather incoherent.
Yeah.
And it's so jarring, but like the gentleman who was speaking, who was Marty Rathbun, says, who was a former head of one of the leaders of the church, that is the end phenomena. That's what happens when your brain is sort of set into what Mike Rinder, another whistleblower, calls the mind prison of Scientology.
Yeah, so I want to get into this, but and I thought that'd be a good way to set this up because Tom Cruise is both, I don't know. I remember an old stand-up comedy routine that where the comedian's telling a story about Tom Cruise, and he refers to him several times as the most famous man in the world. And if he's not, he's up there, right? And and he's also one of the leading members of this church. He's certainly the most famous Scientologist in the world. So that's like an entry point for a lot of people. But and in that clip, there are a few things that he says, and there are a few things that you've even said just now in your discussion about it, that not everybody who's I am not as this is not an insult. This is just value neutral, right? I maybe not quite as fixated on Scientology as you are, but I read Going Clear back when that first came out. That book, which goes into great depth about this stuff, and it was then turned into this documentary that I also watched, which is good. Although actually, I think some of the crazy stuff in that book didn't make it into the movie.
Oh yeah.
So I know a fair amount of what you're talking about, but I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So there are a few terms that were thrown around just here. So one thing that you just mentioned that's probably a good first one is the Sea Org.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
So the Sea Org, it's the Sea Organization. So essentially the Sea Org is the ecclesiastical order of the church. And so it was founded in the 1960s into the 1970s by L. Ron Hubbard, who was the founder of Scientology. He was a very famous pulp science fiction writer. And it
Battlefield
was,
Earth.
yeah, Battlefield Earth, right? Yeah. And the Sea Org, when it was founded, sort of served two purposes. And the two purposes that it served were, one, it was a way of bringing order and structure and a sense of bureaucracy to the church that was desperately needed, in the sense of they were having thousands of members join. There was a lot of money coming in. But the other part of it was that sometime in the late 1960s, well into the mid 1970s, L. Ron Hubbard lived on international waters in a boat called the Apollo, on a ship called the Apollo. And the Sea Org was the staff that staffed this ship. And the reason he did it was because he was under increasing legal scrutiny, both for taxes as well as other irregularities with Scientology. And so the way to avoid any kind of lawsuits or any kind of government oversight, he basically went to the oceans, and he went around the earth on this boat for about almost 10 years. And the Sea Org staffed that boat. And then when he came back, they sort of established the Sea Org as the official order that would run the church. But the thing that's interesting about the Sea Org is it doesn't exist on paper. So all of the legal entities of Scientology that exist, none of them mention the Sea Org at all. And that's on purpose, because the Sea Org is very secretive, but it's also a way for them to sort of have, I think, what I would argue is egregious labor practices. And so, people might make $50 a week working in the Sea Org for years, which of course they take taxes out of. So at some point they're making 40, maybe 50 cents an hour, working horrific conditions. So it's a way of doing that. So that's what the Sea Org is in a nutshell.
Yeah, which is also a small connection. I've certainly so my grandmother in the last years before she died lived in Hemet, California, and so I was there visiting her many times, which is the location of something called the Scientology Gold Base, which I've driven past. This is a convenient picture of the Gold Base with a key location that is labeled there. But I mean, this is where people who sign these. Like you think about, like, okay, what's the most unreasonable labor contract you've ever heard of? And I understand less. I don't want to talk about this in the courtroom. So I understand this is not like legally binding, right? But it's like symbolic. But it does kind of go with everything you're saying about the sub minimum wages and everything else, because this weird status that they're not exactly employees, whatever. They signed billion-year contracts to join the Sea Org. It's like, man, I'm sorry, I've still got another 999 million years on my
Right. Well, and the reason that the billion years is there is because Hubbard believed, and Scientologists believe, that the universe is actually like trillions of years old, and that there's all kinds of you've lived past lives, and you're sort of immortal spiritual beings. So when you die, they call it dropping the body, where the body is merely seen as a vessel, and so then you go on to another body. And so that's why the billion years is there. So in the mindset of Scientologists, billion years is nothing in the span of time that Scientology believes in. But I do think it is a crucial point that Mike Rinder, who was a high-level leader of the church who left in 2007, his book is called A Billion Years, and I do think it does represent the sort of, I think, eternal control that the church wants over its members, not just those who work for the organization, but those who are parishioners, or what they call public.
Yeah, right. So there's right. So there's the the Sea Org in the essay that you wrote, and you also did an episode about this on Red Reviews. I think it's called that I listened to. I was out on a run yesterday, and I think in both of those you kind of you say the Sea Org is like essentially they're the ecclesiastical branch of the Church of Scientology. That's like sort of in a weird way, it's like almost like being a Scientology monk or something.
Yeah.
Your entire life has been given over to this,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's public Scientology. There's this Celebrity Center, and and all of that stuff, and it's definitely so in. You said this really interesting thing about Scientological beliefs, and I definitely do want to get back to that. But before that, though, right, I do want to run through just a little bit more of this terminology, because I think this is sort of revealing and interesting. There is part of that part of the like clip of Tom Cruise being a crazy person. He's like laughing with delight at the thought of a world without SPs. What is an SP?
SPs stands for suppressive persons. Essentially, they are enemies of the church. And anyone who criticizes the church publicly, or anyone who does any harm to the church, whether internally or externally, is seen as a suppressive person. But in true Scientology fashion, there are stages. So you can be like in good standing with the church, or you can be a public person, or just a person like you or I who has never been in the church. But if you start kind of going down the path of like maybe criticizing them or saying things, they call you a potential trouble source, or a PTS. And then once you really go off the deep end and really start going after them, you are a suppressive person. And here's one of the crazier parts about suppressive persons. So the church really doesn't do this now because there's more suppressive people than there are Scientologists at this point. But they used to do formal declares where they would like send someone a letter saying you are formally declared a suppressive person in the eyes of the Church of Scientology. Mark Headley, who worked on the gold base for many, many years, who left in 2005, he was given one of those formal letters. But the weirdest part is, because Germany has been heavily critical in its public policy against Scientology and has basically labeled it not a religion. And in doing so, David Miscavige, who runs Scientology after Hubbard died in 1986, he essentially declared the entire country of Germany suppressive. So if you live in Germany, or you're an expat who's from the US who lives in Germany, or anybody's in Germany, you are a suppressive person by default, even if you know nothing about Scientology.
Awesome. Yeah. So, and this kind of does bring us to something I don't want to spend a lot of time on, because I don't know how interesting this sort of semantic rabbit hole is, but is probably worth at least touching on a little bit, right? That like a word that, is used a lot in connection with Scientology, and I certainly plan on using several times tonight in connection with Scientology, is cult. And in the but then like it's a little bit tricky to sort of say, okay, but like, what's the difference between that and just like a religion, right? Like like as a cult, just like a small unpopular religion. And I do tend to think there are some differences, even if it's best understood as something like a cluster concept. In other words, it's not like here's sort of strict conditions that are going to apply in every case, but like here's this sort of cluster of things that kind of go together. And it's like when we say that something's cult, we're saying it checks not necessarily every one, but like a bunch of boxes in ways that other religions often don't.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. And in fact, there's a psychologist named Dr. Stephen Hassan, who actually left a cult himself. He left the Unification Church and the Moonies in the 1970s. And he became a clinical psychologist to help people escape cults. And I would also call Scientology a cult, without a doubt. And he has what's called the BITE model. which I don't know all the details in the bite model, but basically it's like behavior modification, identity control, things like that, control of language, right? Like we've spent a good chunk of this conversation just defining words, because that's what cults do, right? They create this sort of inner language, so it sort of creates this sort of us versus them mentality, right? And I think with Scientology, it's like the error example of it, because of basically there are people who are former Scientologists who can get in a room and speak in complete Scientologese and no one can understand what they're saying.
Right. Yeah, I actually watched, so after I listened to your discussion, read reviews, and read some of your essay, last night while I was washing dishes, I just, I put on YouTube in the background. I was like, yeah, let's look at some Mike Rinder. That's the guy you're talking about in the essay. It's like, let's find some Mike Rinder on YouTube talking about Scientology. So I just kind of looked something up and put on the first thing I saw, which was this live stream where it's actually kind of funny, interesting to watch, right? Because it's sort of similar and not to like left media kind of live streams, that where it's Mike Rinder and a bunch of other former Scientologists just kind of like chatting. It's a very freewheeling kind of live stream. And it was very much like that, right? It's like the number of like I was following, I think, most of it, right? But it's like the amount of specialized terminology that it goes into this is kind of amazing. And yeah, I think that's kind of revealing in itself. And sure, religions have specialized terminology, but Scientology is a lot of specialized terminology. For things that don't really need specialized terminology, and I think it does contribute to this sense of this thing that's like separated off from the culture and society around it, and certainly something that strikes me as a bit culty. That's not typical, at least if you put in enough qualifiers about like, I don't know, contemporary Western countries or things like that, right? That's not typical of most religions, is the way both that outsiders perceived as hostile are treated, which we've only scratched the surface on with that thing about SPs, and also the way that internal discipline works, which is like, look, there are many kinds of religious organizations that if you do something that's considered, that's like considered heretical in some way, maybe, right? In that religion, you'll like maybe worry that you get kicked out, right? That would be the consequence, right? That like you're either going to be officially condemned somehow, or the absolute worst thing that's going to happen to you is that like, oh, you can't come back. That's how religions typically work. That like the worst thing can happen is like you're excommunicated. But that's kind of the range of possibilities, right? Goes from you're fine to you're kicked out. And in Scientology, there is, I think, a much, there are interesting questions about the degree to which this is always voluntary, that people subject themselves to it. But I think what's inarguable is that the sort of range of ways that they punish people within the organization is much greater than anything that would kind of be imaginable in most modern Western religious organizations, right? So for example, in that picture that I showed earlier of the Scientology gold base in Hemet, California, that it labels something called the Hole. What's that?
So the Hole was something that was put together by Miscavige for basically what he deemed the worst of the worst on what is called the Rehabilitation Project Force, or the RPF, which is essentially a sort of Stalinist re-education camp thing where they all have to wear black. They eat basically scraps that are left over by other Sea Org members. They have to run everywhere. They do tons of manual labor. But for the worst of the worst, they go into the Hole, or they did. And it's essentially two double-wide trailers that were put together by this sort of median, and people had to sleep on the floor, and people, were victims of verbal abuse, physical abuse. There have been people who've been in the Hole, like Mike Rinder, who has testified to this happening to him. Marty Rathbun did, but then he sort of recanted. His story's weird. That's a whole other thing. And So others have said that too. Now, the church has publicly said that they have ended the rehabilitation project force, but they also publicly said that they ended another policy called fair game, which they never did either. So I would imagine the RPF still goes on in some form, but maybe the whole doesn't. But it is really, really extreme and very, very abusive.
Yeah. So the RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force, is probably the biggest thing in the original Going Clear book that didn't really make it to the movie, or I think it was like mentioned for a minute maybe in the movie, but it's like a very big part of the book, because it's kind of, I mean, it's kind of insane that there is this church that operates its own internal gulag, essentially, that they have, that you have committed various, Scientology transgressions. Your ethics is bad. I think it's
You're out ethics. Yep.
You're out ethics. Yeah. Awesome. So this is a church that is punishing people for being out ethics, not by like kicking them out, saying you can't come back next Sunday, right? But with like forced labor, and forcing people to be in these sort of prison-like conditions. Now, I keep using the word force. As I said, it's very unclear in that book, Going Clear. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the author.
Lawrence Wright.
Lawrence Wright, thank you. Lawrence Wright says at one point in the book, he's like, look, probably if the FBI did a raid tomorrow, the majority of people who are in the RPF would say, no, I don't want to leave. I want to stay and do my time and get back in the good graces of the church. But it is at least unclear from an outsider's perspective whether that's a majority or everybody. And there are some reasons to think that at least at some points it hasn't been everybody.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I think it gets to the bigger point of the subtitle of Lawrence Wright's book, Scientology and the Prison of Belief, right? Because yes, like when you're on the RPF or you're in the hole, like it's a literal prison where you're sort of, you're in horrific conditions. But like, as you said, if they were to come in, a lot of them would, well, I'm here of my own accord. And I'm, I am trying to get back in good ethics with the church, and I'm trying to be a good Sea Org member. And that's the mind prison. That's the prison of belief, which, whatever physical scars you might have, the mental scars for a lot of people who leave Scientology arguably are worse. And so I think that's where Scientology goes from being like, because I know a lot of people like, it's funny to like joke, and I do that too. But like what interested me more in studying Scientology is the way in which it is absolutely oppressive. Not just to its members, but to its clergy, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, maybe most oppressive to its clergy, right?
Extremely. And it reminds me very much of, and I think I remember reading this in Mark Fisher's classic, Capitalist Realism, where he talks about the idea of market Stalinism. And it's sort of the worst. It's like the worst abuses of the Stalinist system, with it heavy bureaucracy, really strict authority and hierarchy and punishment, mixed with the worst of capitalism, where it's like the drive for profits, the drive for money. Scientology embodies market Stalinism to me, because its internal organization is extremely bureaucratic and extremely hierarchical and oppressive. But then it's all in service of money. And it's a church that sits on $3 billion. So it's one of those where it's like they're a church that has 25 to 35,000 members, but it's worth $3 billion. And it's that oppressive system that I think really embodies, I remember the first time I read Capitalist Realism and I read that phrase, I went, oh, that's Scientology. Like that was my first thought. And so that's the thing I think what always fascinated me about it.
Yeah, and that is like a really interesting thing about Scientology, because your average religious organization will, like, certainly at least make a big deal of acting as if they're, and with, varying degrees of plausibility depending on which one we're talking about, right? But it's like certainly like at least make a big deal about how they really care about poor people, and like most of all, maybe, right? I mean, this is, Jesus says, with the least of us, right? You do to the least of us, you do to me. Scientology doesn't seem to me there's a lot of pretense to taking an interest in the least of us.
Oh, no. And in fact, I mean, Hubbard said himself, we are to make the able more able. They are not interested in people who have maybe physical or developmental or mental disabilities. They're not interested in people who don't have any money. They're not interested in people who are like, maybe have substance abuse problems. They're way more interested in this sort of, and this is where it's kind of like there's like these cross sections where it's like the L. Ron Hubbard, and he was sort of a product of the 1950s. And I also think of another sort of writer from the 1950s who sort of developed their own cult, which was Ayn Rand. And it's that sort of idea of the Superman, right? The Ubermensch. Like Scientology believes in that. And essentially when you achieve the purest of spiritual enlightenment in Scientology, you're supposed to be able to like walk through walls and read people's minds and move stuff with your mind. Like you're supposed to do all this extra stuff.
So let's talk about this, because this finally takes us, and I don't want to let this go by without doing at least a few minutes on what the actual belief system is.
Yep.
It's like you say you're a church, and you say, oh, so like you sit around worshiping God. I mean, that's what churches are typically about. Well, going out into the world and like helping the poor and the sick and the suffering, right? That's one thing. And then worship, sitting around worshiping God, that's the other thing. Scientology isn't into either of those two. So it's like very confusing to think of it as a church. But and I love the Ayn Rand comparison, by the way. I never thought about that, but that's perfect, because like not only because Ayn Rand did very much did run objectivism as a cult. I mean, like when her like literally like her boyfriend left, and they were like, this man has betrayed objectivism. Like they're like sending out like broadsides to everybody who's involved in it, But so it was very, very culty. But like also the sort of parallel between the way that science talk and tech talk is used in Scientology. It's called the Church of Scientology. It's science, and it's the spiritual tech, right? The sort of parallel between that and the way logic talk is used in objectivism. That the sections of of Atlas Shrugged are named after like logical principles, non-contradiction, excluded middle, with this sort of vague insinuation that if you really understand all this stuff, you'll agree with their moral and political views. And so yeah, I think there's definitely something there. But I want to, and certainly the glorification of like a certain kind of like heroic rich person. But I want to get into the belief system. So they're not worshiping God. In fact, they don't exactly believe in God. There's like maybe a sense in which they sort of think you can become something like a god, which would be in your other podcast about this. I saw, you said this thing that made me laugh very hard about how Mormonism was sort of steampunk Scientology. The sort of not like the sort of boring contemporary version of Mormonism, but like the Brigham Young era stuff where you get to go, rule your own planet after you die. That has a certain steampunk Scientology feel to it. But but if they don't exactly believe in God, what do they believe? I mean, you can save like in the next few minutes when you tell me this, like just think about all the hundreds of thousands of dollars that you're saving our viewers. That like you could just tell us what they think. They don't have to pay for courses.
You don't have to pay. What I'm going to tell you, Scientology will tell you if you hear it without going through the proper channels, it would kill you. Like that's the argument they make. But essentially, in Scientology, there is something called the bridge to spiritual freedom, and it's not really a bridge. It's actually more like a ladder. But it's you have certain levels, and you hit certain levels in it, right? So one of the first levels is called clear, and clear was something that that Hubbard came up with in his book Dianetics, the Science of Mental Health, which was published in 1950. And as I say in my essay, it's like this weird pastiche of like Freudianism and hypnosis and like kind of carnival tricks and like folk psychology. But basically he believed that there was like a reactive mind and then there was like the logical mind, and that if you can get rid of your reactive mind, you become in a state of clear. So you're like perfectly logical. You have an eidetic memory, so you can remember everything you've ever read or anything you've ever seen, a name you've ever heard. And then above all,
which is sort of like, I just want to pause there to say that it kind of sounds like what somebody would come up with if they just heard like Buddhism explained to them for the first time, but they would also, I don't know, they like read a lot of Robert Heinlein novels or something, and they're like, okay, but like, how can this, how can this give you mutant powers?
So 2 quick points on that. One, Hubbard wrote in other stuff that he was basically a reincarnated version of the Buddha. So he thought he was the Buddha. So there's part of that. And then the second thing is that he was a contemporary of Heinlein. And they all wrote for a magazine called Astounding Science Fiction, whose editor, John W. Campbell, helped publish parts of Dianetics in Astounding Science Fiction and helped Hubbard write the first version of it, which is a history that people don't often remember. But anyway, so there's clear. And then once you get up into what are called the OT levels, or operating thetan levels, and thetans are Scientology speak for souls. They're sort of immortal spiritual beings. That's the phrase that they use. And all of us have thetans all throughout our bodies. And the goal of the operating thetan levels is to essentially purge your body of these body thetans, what they call BTs, and then sort of have what they call cause over life. So that's where I get into the whole like reading people's minds, walking through walls, essentially becoming an X-Men. That Scientology doesn't believe in a god because its whole thing is that you become a god. And for most,
I remember in Going Clear, one of the most memorable scenes from that is somebody who's recounting to write sitting in a car with Tom Cruise, giving him this, helping him go through the Scientology exercise, whereas people went by. He was supposed to, use his abilities that he's gaining as he goes across, progresses through the bridge to total freedom, to sense their emotional states, what's going on in their mind. And like, it was like, let's imagine that, like, this is like the parking lot of grocery stores. Like, so like, imagine like you just like done your grocery shopping in LA, and unbeknownst to you, as you're walking back to the car, the most famous movie star in the world is trying to read your mind.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's pretty wild. And Mark Headley has some great stories about him doing auditing with Tom Cruise, because that's a big component of Scientology, is the practice of auditing, where people have probably seen the e-meters where you hold the 2 cans and there's like the little meter, and it's like this weird form of like therapy, but it's not really a therapy, and it's very strange. But it's like, get on the cans, and you grab the cans, and if whatever you say, you can lie. Like, people have talked, like, I've lied my butt off just to get out of these auditing sessions. But because the meter doesn't really matter, it just measures like skin. It just measures like skin texture. It doesn't really do anything. It all has the veneer of science, but isn't really scientific or reasonable. But yeah, so we have with operating thetans, and of course, I think everybody who's interested in Scientology knows about OT3. And OT3 is kind of the one that everybody kind of knows about from either the South Park episode or Going Clear or other things. And OT3 is what Hubbard called I think he called it the wall, or the wall of fire, where it's like the most important thing. And essentially at OT3, you get the Scientology origin myth. And the origin myth is that Earth was actually a planet called TGAC, and it was a part of what was called the Galactic Empire. And there was a space intergalactic overlord named Xenu, who put all these people in these basically these bomb pods on these planes, which looked a lot like DC-8s from the 1950s, and dropped these people into volcanoes, and their spiritual entities went off everywhere. And then they started to cling to people's bodies.
That's where the body thetans come from.
Yeah, that's where the body thetans come from. It's all these people who were sort of preserved in like glycol or something. They were like cold frozen, and for committing crimes, because Earth was known as a prison planet, which is where you have the intersection of Scientology and Alex Jones, like the Earth as prison planet thing. But yeah, so Yeah, but yeah, so once you learn all of that, the way that you learn OT3 is you pretty much have to be maybe 5, 10, sometimes 15 or 20 years in, and about 200,000 to $250,000 in auditing costs just to get to OT3. And when you get OT3, you go into a room, they bring you a suitcase, and in the suitcase are the handwritten notes of L. Ron Hubbard that tell you this story. And it's absolutely bonkers.
Yeah. And I remember, one of the people who's interviewed and Going Clear actually makes a comment about it. It's like after he read this, there's a while where he was wondering, like, okay, is this like a test that they're going to tell me something obviously crazy, and like I have to like reject it, or they're going to kick me out for that, right? Like,
Yep. That was Paul Haggis. That was Paul Haggis. And you're right. Like it's one of those things where, because you have to think about it, right? Like, because Scientology, as you mentioned in the earlier, is kind of really one of the only mainstream religions where you genuinely have to pay to play. You don't get this stuff in Scientology without paying for it. And it's thousands and thousands of dollars. They have people take out credit cards. They do mortgages on their homes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points that I've heard, I think you make, or anyway, somebody make, is that they have you go to Scientology events, and I guess I should say, I mean, like I know, I've always, anyway, so there's like, there are different degrees of things like that, like Scientology sponsored events, that it's like how sort of overt they are about what the point is. So for example, the Scientology event that, I mean, people I know have been at, is they sponsor this contest for science fiction writers called Writers of the Future. And I actually, knew the guy who won that sometime. Like something, of course, people always say when they come back from it, it's like, I don't know, nobody tried to recruit me, which I remember my friend Nick Mamatas pointed out once. It's like, yeah, that's what you're getting paid for, to say, oh, no, nobody's trying to recruit me, right? I mean, like that is the point. Thank you for your, your service to the Church of Scientology by doing that. But like, you go to a lot of Scientology events, I've heard people point out, and even though, I mean, they're not recruited from low-income people, as we discussed, to put it mildly, every car in the parking lot is going to be a beater, because people don't have money to spend on their cars. They are spending all of their money on these courses. They're trying to get to the higher OT levels.
Yeah, that's right. And Scientology is like this weird microcosm of capitalism in kind of a nutshell, where like there's this like really top level people who have millions and millions of dollars, either through the church or because they were successful business people and they've donated money to the church. And then you have like the middle rung people, which are most folks who are either middle class or upper middle class, who have kind of crappy cars in the parking lot and they've mortgaged their houses. And then there's a permanent underclass that exists to service the organization, and that's the Sea Org. And it feels like that's when I remember we had a conversation, a while back about like Scientology is like the most American religion, in the sense that it is totally built upon wealth and the accumulation of wealth and the accumulation of money and the accumulation of land and assets and private property and ultimately power.
Right.
And I think that's what makes, I think, Scientology particularly, I think, a danger to democracy, and a danger, honestly, to the First Amendment, because I think that we should have a genuine conversation about, what does count as a religion. The IRS is very, very loose on what a religion is, and for some reasons, for good reasons and bad.
Sure.
But with Scientology, it's sort of allowed so much that would never be allowed in a business, or wouldn't be allowed in government or anything like that. So that's the part of it that animates me to learn about it and tell people about it.
Yeah, I mean, so I do want to get into this, and this, this is kind of, the Church of Scientology is kind of an extreme example of the absurdity of having, of having tax exemptions that are linked to status as religion, because you know, the second you pass that law, you are, you know, you are saying, oh, now the IRS or, you know, various federal agencies are now in the business of deciding what's a religion and what's not, which is a
Right.
ridiculous business for them to be in. I mean, it's like, what's the, and I think the Scientology example nicely shows that, you know, because like, yeah, there's obviously something kind of absurd about saying that this, like, you know, that this creepy money laundering scheme, kind of, you know, pyramid scheme sort of, that is, you know, that has, that's, you know, that's like, you know, keeping people as quasi slaves and all that, you know, gets to like get away with everything because they use the magic word religion, right? You know, if it was the, you know, if it was just the organization of Scientology, not the Church of Scientology, right? You know, it wouldn't have status, but it's like also like, yeah, I don't really want the government to decide, you know, making strict rules about what's a real religion and what's not a religion. I would much prefer to just get out of that business by not giving this tax exemptions in the first place. But like, you know, when you talk about, you know, some of what you're saying about the First Amendment and all of that, you know, I think that, you know, when we talked about suppressive persons earlier, I sort of said something in passing about how we're just kind of scratching the surface of Scientology's relationship to hostile outsiders. And so part of that relationship has involved historically something called fair game, which is a term you used earlier, but we didn't pause to sort of go into what that means, which we should do. And part of it has actually involved like stuff that's kind of like when you read about it, like, oh my god, really? Like that they have that they've actually they have like actually a history of like infiltrating like the FBI and stuff like that. So so yeah, if you could just do a couple minutes on what fair game is and some of what that's involved, and Operation Snow White.
Yeah, absolutely. So, fair game was a policy that L. Ron Hubbard developed in the 1960s to essentially deal with critics, and the point was to, as he described it, ruin them utterly or ruin them completely. And so, when you know, and essentially, it's a form of harassment. So, you know, former members have talked about Sea Org people or Scientology showing up to their place of work or their homes, stealing their trash. Scientology hires private investigators to go after people. Mike Rinder has caught some of those on tape. Marty Rathbun did too. Mark Headley has. And they try to noisily investigate its former members to try to get them to shut up, to essentially to get them to be quiet. Some of the times this has led to lawsuits, and it's also led to some of its most egregious actions. So in the 1970s, under the auspices of a part of the Sea Org called the Guardian's Office, which is now called the Office of Special Affairs, there was something called Operation Snow White, which was to this day the largest private infiltration of the federal government in American history. So when people think, so who infiltrated the government more than anybody? It wasn't the Russians, wasn't the Chinese, it was the Scientologists. And the reason they did it was essentially to purge government agencies of documents related to Scientology, because at the time, Scientology did not have tax exempt status. And the federal government was very earnestly trying to go after them. The Operation Snow White would eventually lead to the arrests of maybe a dozen people. Multiple people went to prison, including L. Ron Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard. And Hubbard himself was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. So, you know, they are an organization that has a ton of money to essentially harass people who've left, harass critics, and to, you know, strong arm government agencies or even infiltrate them.
Yeah, which is just an amazing thing to think about, that they have that Scientology was like sending people to work for, you know, the FBI, you know, that
Yep.
say, you know, like these all these, you know, the IRS certainly, and so, you know, an obvious kind of naive question here. This is all, well, L. Ron is still alive. LRH, L. Ron Hubbard, because you can't Scientology, you have to have specialized terminology for everything. Like even like
Oh, yeah.
references to the name of your founder. You can't just say the whole name because then everybody will know who you mean, right?
Yeah.
You have to be like a little bit. You have to have a little bit of specialized terminology. But this is while LRH is still alive. So how is it that this guy did not end up spending a zillion years in prison?
So one of the main reasons why was because the church used its incredible amount of assets and sort of its corporate structure kept him off the books. And so throughout the 60s and into the 70s, he would do policy letters where he would literally sign them like LRH in his initials. By the time you get into late 70s, early 80s, he's writing what are called policy recommendations, which to everybody in the church, they know they're orders, but they call them recommendations. They don't even have his name on them. They just have 3 hash marks at the bottom. That's how you knew it came from him. So they just did all these elaborate things. He lived from the late 70s into the early to mid 80s when he passed in 1986. He lived in essentially like a trailer on this like ranch out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't have contact with a lot of people. And so, it was a mix of with the corporate structure of the church, his ability to hide, and the keeping his name off of stuff was a big part of how they did that.
Yeah. And I think, some of these indictments too, like after Operation Snow White, for example, because it's like if you're in like season 3 or something of The Sopranos, it's not like the FBI is confused about who's running the mafia in northern New Jersey, right? But that doesn't mean that they have enough on him, that they have enough on Tony that they can actually arrest him. It's kind of like that, right? It's like the indictments will kind of say, it's like, look, we know L. Ron Hubbard ordered this stuff, but like they can't actually name him as a co-conspirator because there are these layers separating him from like anything that you could actually pin down in a courtroom.
Absolutely, yep. And that was how it was run for many, many years. And in some respects, it's still how it's run today with its leader, David Miscavige.
Yeah, so let's talk about this guy. So David Miscavige takes over, not pictured, his lovely wife Shelley. For some reason, but
wonder where she is.
Yeah, exactly. David Miscavige, like this is kind of an amazing story because, like, when he like the process of this guy taking over the Church of Scientology after the death of L. Ron Hubbard is like, it's like, I don't know, for anybody who watched like the comedy The Death of Stalin, right? It's like that kind of thing, right? That there's this like there is this kind of crazy power struggle and sort of palace coup, within this organization that again is just very I think like it sort of has to, like, the more you hear about it, the less like it's like the stranger it sounds, right? So tell me about David Miscavige and like his rise to power within this organization.
Sure. So David Miscavige came into the church as a child. His dad, Ron, got him into the church. And right away, he became a very trusted advisor and confidant to Hubbard and some of the higher up leaders in the Scientology. He was a part of what was called the Commodore's Messenger Org, or the CMO, which was the organization that would relay messages between Scientology and Hubbard. And there is essentially a power struggle when L. Ron Hubbard dies in 1986. He dies of a stroke. Interestingly enough, a man who wrote thousands of pages, hundreds of books, never actually wrote a policy about what to do with Scientology when he died.
Which I do want to pause on because, like, I'm I'm not making a claim here. I'm raising an eyebrow. But they have this is a guy who would literally write policies about like exactly how people should go about washing the windows at Scientology-owned buildings. That's not an exaggeration. It's not hyperbole. He would literally write up a whole policy about that.
Yep.
Like he thought of everything. He wrote detailed policies for how he wanted everything to happen. So one might raise an eyebrow. It's like, did he really not write anything about what he wanted to happen?
Right. And this is where we get into it's weird because like the comparison to Stalin is very apropos because people talk about Lenin's last testament,
Yeah.
and there are some people who say it's real, there's some people who say it isn't, and the veracity of that or whatever. There was something that Hubbard did actually write or was alleged to have written where he wanted, and he laid out very clearly that he wanted Pat and Annie Broker to take over the church, who were his highest confidants and were part of the CMO as well. But there was essentially a coup, and David Miscavige started to like pick off people in the organization that he didn't want in there. So they started going away, including Pat and Annie Broker themselves. And then he started getting all these other high up people to essentially back him. And he tied himself to Hubbard as closely as possible, very similar to how Stalin did with Lenin. And he said that this letter was a forgery and it was never really clear. And in fact, it was me. I'm the person that should really take this over. And essentially there was a coup and he took over in 1986 and he became what is called the chairman of the board of the Religious Technology Center, or COBRTC. That's his official title. And he's been in that position for almost 40 years.
Yeah. And yeah, that is pretty astonishing. He also, I should say, I remember the story about David Miscavige, where he's much earlier in his life, before he becomes the head of the whole thing. He's like with some older Scientologist. He's like staying with him maybe, and this guy's like, "Oh, we should do the blah blah blah," right? Some like Scientology, thing that they're supposed to do is like it's like there's some tech that they're supposed to use for something or other. And young David's like, "Oh, I don't need to do that. I'm already clear from a past life."
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting because people would ask, so like, does Dave get auditing? Like, does Dave do course? Is he on course? No, Dave's not on course. Like, he's not like, he can just say, oh, I'm OT8, baby. Like, and he's also been telling people for 30 years that OT9 and 10 are coming. And that's what he uses to keep people in the church. So they're like, I know things might be rough right now, but if we just hit these targets, then I can release OT9 and 10. There is no OT9 and 10.
Yeah. So Hubbard did 1 through 8 and
Yep.
died before he could do the 9 and 10 that they're supposed to still have.
Yeah. And if you look at the chart, it goes up to like 15 or something like that. But it's and it just says to be released, and it is said to be released for 30 plus years.
Yeah. So
It's crazy.
yeah, that is crazy. While we are on LRH, it is interesting to think about. Obviously, I'm asking you to speculate here, but I think about like C.S. Lewis has this classic argument for the divinity of Jesus, where he says, well, here are the options. That Jesus is either, he's either Lord, liar, or lunatic. It's the trilemma. And because if you say he was making all these claims that Jesus was making the New Testament, if it's not real, then he was either a liar or a lunatic. And are you really saying Jesus was a liar or a lunatic, right? You can't. So, and like, and he's sort of trying to push back against the people who are like, oh, Jesus is a great moral teacher, but he's not literally God or whatever. And say, no, that doesn't work. It's only these 3. And I always thought, well, this seems like a sort of weird view of human psychology. Are these like, I think when you say people make grandiose claims and, it's like, okay, to what extent do you believe that? To what extent are you conning people? I think the answer is actually pretty often a little bit of both. And I think that for L. Ron Hubbard especially, I don't know. You've looked into this more than I have, but I mean, I'm curious about your take about the sort of proportions of like, I mean, look, this is a church that shares many characteristics of a pyramid scheme. And I think he was not subtle about, trying to extract as much money as possible from his followers. but it also doesn't seem like he was completely making it up in the sense that, I mean, he was making it up, but it also doesn't seem like he was being completely insincere. I mean, like he himself seemed to be actually very concerned with, developing the tech and everything. Like even kind of when he was already like very rich from all this, and it doesn't seem to have been a financial motive. Like he, I guess like the really pithy way of saying what I'm asking you here is, to what extent did this man believe his own bullshit?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that many people have asked. And my answer is actually fairly similar to Mike Rinder's, which is it's a little bit of both. So I think that he was absolutely in it for the money, and cared about the money so darn much that when he died, he explicitly said that all of his money, which he left to the church, would not go to the church until they got tax exempt status. So he was very much about the money. There's the classic story that Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov, who were contemporaries of him, have said, like, he's like, if you really want to make money, you start a religion. Like, that's like the classic, like, apocryphal tale.
Yeah.
And there's truth to that. But if you really understand L. Ron Hubbard, like the last years of his life, where he's literally having one of his confidants try to do weird experiments on him to like remove body thetans, and it almost kills him. Like he wants his like friend to blow him up so that he can get the body thetans out. I think that Hubbard, by the end of it, really believed it. And I think Lawrence Wright said it best, where he said, the beliefs of Scientology are an attempt to understand the mind of L. Ron Hubbard. I think that he did believe a lot of it. And I also think he was in it for the money. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that people have speculated that he might have had what is called temporal lobe epilepsy. Which some of the symptoms are sort of delusions of grandeur, hyper-religiosity, hypergraphia, so like writing everything, like excessive writing. And I think there's probably some suggestion for that, but of course, there's no autopsy, but there's a possibility that that's true. So I do think it's a mix of money and true believer. Miscavige, on the other hand, I think he's just in it for the money.
Yeah, that seems exactly right. So speaking of the money, Jake, do we have the Scientology very expensive clip?
Scientology's journey to spiritual enlightenment is done through a series of courses that Rinder says cost money. A lot of money.
300, 500,000. That's for you to pay for your own participation in Scientology. This is why I said it's a business masquerading as a religion.
Yeah. So this is like, I mean, like it kind of goes to the point earlier about analogies between Scientology and more mainstream religions, that if you want to call it a religion, and that's a sort of fascinating question in itself, right? What do we actually mean by that, right? If you like, if you just believe some stuff about reality that's non-standard, right? Is that kind of enough? Anyway, but they have it's more mainstream religion. You have like tithing, right? There's like a certain, proportion, maybe even of your income, right, that you might have to give up. And, I will say, as you sort of go along the spectrum, where on one end is the Methodist Church down the street, and on the other end is the Church of Scientology, the closer you get to the Church of Scientology, the more money they're typically asking from you. But like, this is not like tithing. I mean, this is a really like extreme financial investment that people are being asked to make, which is tied into this phrase you used a couple times about Scientology as kind of a mind prison, because there's a comment in the chat earlier about it's like a religion based on the sunk cost fallacy, and like,
Yep.
Yeah, there's like something to that, right? Because it's like one of the things keeping people in it is like, Jesus Christ, I've already spent $300,000 on this thing, right? It's like I should stay in it until I get the really good stuff.
Right. And in fact, there's a great episode of the Leah Remini Scientology The Aftermath show where they interview a woman named Mary Kahn who got all the way through to OTA and she hated it. And she didn't really want to do it, but she was already so far in. And so it was like, well, I've already done all this other stuff. I might as well just do the rest of it. That's, I think, exactly right. I think the other thing about Scientology that's interesting is that, you know, Hubbard from the very beginning was very much we are a fee for service organization. You give us money, we will give you something, right? And under Miscavige, that has changed dramatically. So not only do people pay for courses, but they're constantly hitting up their wealthier members to pay for, you know, a new Scientology building or a new Scientology program or something else. So they're constantly hitting them up for money, and they give them like awards, like they'll call them like platinum meritorious or some nonsense. And so it's a mixture of like extraction from the members in terms of fee for service, in terms of getting auditing or courses. But then there's also this other component of them just straight up taking money, which Hubbard was very much against, which is how like Miscavige just runs it differently than Hubbard did.
Yeah, right. So it actually, he's actually managed to make Scientology more culty.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Oh yeah. And it's very much like when you were talking about earlier, we were talking about like a pyramid scheme or whatever, like a lot of that was instituted in the 90s when Miscavige started what was called the Ideal Org program. So orgs are organizations. That's what they call, you know, churches of Scientology. They call them orgs. And the idea was to make them ideal. So they would hit up their parishioners for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for these big, beautiful buildings with state-of-the-art AV technology and all this stuff. And these buildings are empty. No one's in them. And in fact, when they would do openings for them, they would fly out all the Scientologists or all the Sea Org members they could get in an area just so that the place looked packed. And then a week later, there was nobody in there. And so they're using all of this money, which is tax-free, to build these buildings that no one is in, that they own. So it's like this weird money laundering / real estate scheme.
Yeah. No, and like in the actually. Jake, if we have the IRS tax exempt clip, I mean, like I think this really kind of puts a point on what Justin's saying here.
People do ask, how did David Miscavige come into power? There was an organizational structure that was put in place by L. Ron Hubbard, so that no one person was in charge.
Right.
And there were checks and balances, right?
Correct.
Just to make sure that nobody really was the leader. David took that out immediately.
He managed to manipulate and maneuver, getting rid of anybody in a position who could check him.
Yeah.
And that very, very much included the Internal Revenue Service.
On October the 1st, the IRS issued letters recognizing Scientology and every one of its organizations as fully tax exempt.
It was vital for him to gain religious recognition or tax exempt status for Scientology. He could promote that he had accomplished what L. Ron Hubbard hadn't been able to accomplish and stand in front of the adoring crowds and say, I pulled it off, sir, I did it. But it also removed the only real oversight there is into Scientology. The IRS cannot go in and audit a church. An exempt organization doesn't have to provide any information to the public about what do they do with their money.
I was led to believe the IRS had been persecuting Scientology forever, and David Miscavige was now the first one to ever make. And the IRS recognized Scientology as being fully tax exempt. Scientology did have tax exemption before, and it took it away because it found L. Ron Hubbard was using the money for his own personal gain.
And what I mean, there's a lot of points of interest there, but like what really hits me about this is just like, taking a long step back and kind of thinking about some of the reasons that, you and I originally thought it'd be interesting to have this conversation. Like, if this is not this sort of, like, this is something that, like, if you or I, like, wrote the screenplay to a movie that was, like, kind of trying to, like, satirize, like, a late capitalist society, turning everything into that, right? Then, like, having a meeting of a church where leader of the church is announcing, and we are now officially tax exempt, and there are fireworks going on because of their tax status. Like, that would be like anybody who's like reading off that script and like, dude, that's a little too on the nose.
right. It's and not only that, but there's also big graphics in that other clip where it's like the war is over, because they described it as the war with the IRS. And yeah, I mean, I think that I think that it's no coincidence to me that as the United States sort of slid into the sort of neoliberal mode where, deregulation, tax cuts, the destruction of any semblance of social democracy, any sense of oversight to organizations. I feel like, the rise of Scientology is very, akin to the rise of like Oral Roberts or Pat Robertson or, Jim Baker, the sort of televangelists or the prosperity gospel people. And that's part of the reason why I think removing tax exempt status from Scientology would be really a big deal and important, is because if Scientology lost its tax exempt status and the IRS decided to have a little more teeth in terms of like, you actually have to spend this money for social purposes, this has to be in the public good, then, there's a good shot that like Joel Osteen's books would then be audited, or Joyce Meyer's books would also be audited. And like, I think that that's a good thing,
Yes,
because,
exactly.
because, in this country, religions pretty much get away with anything. And I think and while I don't want the federal government in the business of defining what a religion is, I do want them in the business of defining what a religion who serves the public good is.
Yeah, that's probably a good distinction. And Scientology is not the only case of a religion that, at the very least, rides this line, right? I mean, this is like, I used to, I remember back in like the 2000s, I'd go over, to my friend Les's house, who was the, only person in my group of friends who had cable TV, and one of the things we'd do is like we were like up late drinking or whatever, and we'd like hate watch the 700 Club, and there was and on the 700 Club, like Pat Robertson, like while they were doing fundraising appeals, right? It's like the phone lines are open, and get the money and everything. Pat, his son Gordon, and like one other person in the show would like link hands and bow their heads and do this thing where they say, Pat would be like, "Oh, God is telling me right now there's a man in Ohio who has horrible pain in his back, and he's relieving that man's pain." There's also like parenthetically like, "Man, God can tell you as a man who's in Ohio where his pain." He couldn't give you a name
or an address or social security number, nothing.
Right, like yeah, like a phone number, so you can call it in if you can tell his story on air,
right,
yeah. And so it's like, yeah, this is like, this is the financial element of this, is like not subtle, and then like this, and then there's stuff that's like much worse than that. I remember like a few years later seeing like these like late night infomercials for like these prosperity gospel slash faith healing, kinds of ministries where they would do obviously faked footage of them, like helping blind people see and stuff like that. They would sell products like literally my favorite was something called the End Times Wealth Glove, which was a glove you were supposed to put on and point to the heavens and say, "I swear I'm not making this up. This is all in the infomercial. Say, money cometh," and it was gonna cause you to get prosperity, from Jesus. There was, and it's like a part of a lot of these things is like the prosperity gospel preacher could like drive around in a nice car and like all this stuff. It's like, and that's all great, right? Because that just shows that God favors him.
Right.
Like it's not even, it's not even hypocritical. So it's like these are things that are definitely, like feel like you're it's the it's like the formula from Capital, MCM, except like without the C. right?
Yep.
You know, you just like,
It's just M goes straight to M prime. Yeah.
yeah. M prime, M prime, prime. Like you don't actually have to provide anything right in between. You know, at least like
Yeah.
the capitalist
I
has
mean,
to provide.
it is like with Scientology, especially because it's like, you know, it's selling, like people always say like they joke of like religion is selling an invisible product, but like Scientology, it's not an invisible product. Like they give you stuff like it, you know, in the sense that like you get books, you get courses, you get all this stuff, right? And it gives you it sort of fulfills that like consumerist edge, right? Because I don't think it's a coincidence that like Dianetics and Scientology became popular in an age where mass consumer culture was becoming a thing in the United States. And so I think like it also kind of feels that itch too, for some, but then other people are just like, oh God, I have to buy the books again, you know, and that kind of stuff.
But it helps you feel like, so, you know, we've used this phrase several times tonight, the bridge to freedom, the bridge to total freedom,
Yep.
Which I've seen you say, you know, would be more accurate. Like actually the metaphor they really should have used that would have like captured better the structure of what's going on is a ladder, right? That, because it's like a bridge, you just kind of saunter across, right? This is, you know,
Yep.
here there are distinct rungs on the letter. There are letters, numbers, you know, the OT3, whatever, you know, that they have
Yep.
and so the stuff is probably important here. I mean, like in the same way, like, yeah, those you know, prosperity gospel infomercials where, you know, I mean, actually my favorite was there was actually a thing where you could like literally send them money and they say, and that'll be a seed.
Oh yeah.
And, you know, so it's like you're not even getting anything. You're just like literally just sending the money, and you know.
Oh yeah. And this stuff has origins. So I wrote my master's thesis on late 19th century religion and free thought. And there was a preacher named Dwight Moody. Moody Bible College is named after him. Billy Graham went to Moody Bible College, and he has a whole speech called "Sowing and Reaping." You know, it's the phrase from the book of Philippians, you know, you reap what you sow, right? And it's the origins of prosperity gospel are in something Dwight Moody wrote 140 years ago, right? Now, obviously, there might have been other earlier versions, but like the version that would become the thing that everybody kind of knows kind of starts with him as this sort of revival preacher who would go to towns and sort of, you know, you reap what you sow.
And I was going to say in the Scientology case, though, I mean, it probably is significant because, you know, it goes with the point about sunk cost fallacy and all that. But, you know, you have you have to have some stuff like, you know, like you have, like you're not going to keep, you know, climbing across that ladder bridge forever. Like, without some sense of accomplishment that like you've made some progress. So like you're not just staying in place. You guys like, no, see, I crossed this threshold. They gave me this thing for that, you know, like here's like some tech, you know, that I, you know, I've got I have at least a certificate, you know, they have, you know.
It's a very big one too. If you hit a certain OT level, it's huge. You know, Leah Remini has hers, and I've seen other people's where they're just these big, huge documents that are hand calligraphied on. But here's the crazy thing about Scientology: because there's basically nothing new, they will have people do things again. So, like, they introduced something called like the new era Dianetics. So you had to learn Dianetics again. You had to learn how to audit again. Then they had something called the Golden Age of Tech, where they re-released all of L. Ron Hubbard's books. You had to buy those and you had to reread those again. And then they re-released new rules for the OT levels. So you had to do the OT levels again, like, because they can't sell anybody anything new. So all Miscavige can do is like figure out ways to like rehash and repackage and, you know, digitally remaster whatever Scientology can offer people.
Yeah. Right. It's I suppose it's the spiritual equivalent of the scene, you know, people remember in like the first season of The Wire when they have whichever one of the gangsters it was taking like the community college business classes, Stringer Bell, maybe anyway, who's going, you know, he asked his professor, it's like, what should you do if like, you don't, you know, if like, you know, all you can get is like kind of a substandard version of the product. And what he ends up recommending is like, I mean, presumably he doesn't know he means heroin, but they have what he ends up recommending is like essentially they just come up with a bunch of different names for like the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, like, so it's like, oh, you know, people will imagine there's a difference or whatever. It's like, yeah, I mean, ultimately, if L. Ron only wrote 8 of these and Miscavige for whatever reason isn't himself or hiring somebody or whatever to try to do an Elrod impression and do further levels, like he's not confident, that he can pull it off or whatever. Like this is what you've got, right? I mean, it's like that.
Yep.
Then yeah, I mean, you're just gonna have to rebrand it forever, because it's like it's and then I guess at least once people, I guess the people who've been in long enough will eventually die off, and so they won't. Which, by the way, they shouldn't, according to Scientological teaching. Like, if you really have progressed this far along the bridge, you shouldn't be like dying of old age. You shouldn't be getting cancer.
Right, right. And the thing is, like, part of the reason why, and this is to the extent where there may have been a time where I think Miscavige may have believed it more, in the sense that there was always a thing about that when Hubbard died, that he would come back in 21 years. So 2007 was the year that Hubbard was supposed to come back. And on the gold base that we talked about earlier, there's a whole house there called Bonnyhead that is for him. They lay out his clothes every day. They have his cool cigarettes there every day. Like they clean it up.
There's like a book that he was reading when he died.
Yeah, there's a book when he's reading. It's right there. It's like $1 million mansion for a dead man. And but around that time, like, Miscavige was getting a little weary. And there have been people who have said, I am the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard. But the church never takes them seriously, which is interesting, because I'm like, well, how would you know? But so it's and so yeah, I mean, I think that Miscavige is in a real bind, in the sense that, like, there is nothing new. There can't be anything new. So it's just repackaging and rehashing. They're doing right now, what they're doing is the golden age of admin, where they're going back and rehashing and repackaging all of the admin materials and stuff. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. So I think, right. And that is interesting. I would love to know, is there like a test for like people who claim to be Elrond reincarnated, right? It's like, what do you have to what do you have to do to pass the test? But yeah, I want to obviously we're running late. I want to go to the post game for patrons, but maybe the last thing before we do this, do want to just go back to the guy who we were writing about in the original essay. So Mike Rinder, who wrote this book, A Billion Years: My Escape from a Life in the Highest Ranks of Scientology, which is what you were writing about in your essay. And he has this clip where he's talking. Well, actually, Jake, I think it's this is the last one we're going to watch tonight. It's called Mike Rinder Torture.
Rinder left the church 20 years later, after he says he was punished by Miscavige following a news account critical of Scientology. Rinder says Miscavige sent him to The Hole, a detention center on the grounds of Scientology's headquarters in Southern California.
It consisted of 2 double-wide trailers that had been put on foundations and connected. And it was...
How many people might be in the hole at one time?
Well, I counted at one point that there was 130.
130 in 2 double wides?
Yes. And the doors were barred. There was bathrooms, but no showers. The sleeping arrangements were on the floor.
And, this is, so you think about what this guy went through. And so it includes, obviously, this element of pretty grotesque, like, physical unfreedom that he's talking about there. But I think what he would tell you, and you talk about in your essay, is that there's also this kind of pretty profound mental unfreedom when you're in the grips of this thing. I mean, it's like if you think about like what are the parts of like 1984 everybody always finds the creepiest, right? It's all the stuff about like training Winston Smith to has been tortured so much that that they not only will he say that 2 and 3 don't make 5, he believes that that 2 and 3 don't make 5 anymore if the party says that 2 and 3 aren't 5. And there is something that's sort of parallel here that in fact one of the things that was most striking to me in your essays, you were talking about how when he was a kid and his parents were in Scientology, which is how he got into it so early and spent so much of his life in it. But they were also sending him to this private Christian school just because it was a good school, and so he had to go to chapel in the morning. And when he was in chapel, I mean, he was describing in his book, it's like he would think, he would like sort of in the privacy of his own head at least make some pretty sharp skeptical points about that religion, right? That it's like, oh, if God is all powerful, why does he care if I believe this, blah blah blah, right? It's like, and it's like, okay, so there's like definitely some critical thinking going on there, right? But it's not for Scientology, because the entire structure is built to stop you from doing that, to discourage you in every way possible from any kind of critical scrutiny. Okay, how many DC-8s would it have taken to get all the things to the volcanoes and across the intergalactic?
Yep.
Like you're just not supposed to think about that. Yep. In fact, I think there's a lot of effort being put into just not thinking in general about it. Like just kind of accepted it, right? This is maybe like if you think about why. Okay, why have we been talking about this for the last hour and a half? It's like part of it is that it's just fascinating and fun, and I'll own that, right? But also, like, as far as like church memberships go, this is a tiny one. It has those 35,000 people, might include some of the most famous people in the world, but they have because they they recruit so well among celebrities, but still 35,000 people. And a few $1 billion granted, but like part of it is what we were talking about earlier about the way that this is kind of the the most American religion, the sort of like ultimate religion of like capitalism, but it's but there is also a point here that's maybe worth talking about for a minute as we wrap up the main show tonight about freedom, right? Because it's like this is something that this is like the core of left politics is or should be that we care about people as individuals, right? That like not the sort of not what people mean when they talk about individualism, when what they really care about is just property rights, right? But like we care about human flourishing and human freedom, right? And this is, and so if you just kind of wanted to close out our discussion by just kind of speaking to that for a minute or two, and how that relates to your interest in Scientology.
Yeah. So as somebody who has who studied religion, I write about religion a lot. I find that there are forms of religion that can be, I think, very beautiful for people. I think that can be very satisfying for people, and that can actually be in service of the cause of human freedom. You mentioned Cornel West earlier. I mean, I find him to be one of my influences and heroes too. And that sort of, but with Scientology, what I wanted to kind of get at is this idea of truly rejecting the dogma and embracing freedom. And I think that's something that is a lesson I think anybody can take away from, which is that, regardless of whatever convictions you may have, it's always good to keep an open mind. It's always good to learn from different perspectives. And ultimately, it's important to have a sense of mental freedom. And that means the freedom to, change your mind, or the freedom to reject a belief or accept a belief, the right to do those things. And in Scientology, there's none of that. It's this ironclad system that you either have to accept or it will reject you. And I think that Rinder's story is one where it is a testament to human freedom, where he decided one day, I'm done. I can't take this anymore. I'm done. And he has talked very eloquently about how much his life in the last, almost 20 years has become more free, more prosperous, and more happy. And I think that in that regard, that's the best thing about learning about Scientology, is those who leave it and those who find real freedom outside of it.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.